Welcome to the review video for the Ecosystems and Biodiversity series for middle school science. This is designed to help students pass an assessment into the Summit platform, but even if you're not a Summit student, you can still use this if you're trying to learn about things like what is biodiversity and how we measure it, why it is important for ecosystems stability, how ecosystems change over time in response to disturbances, and the process of ecosystem recovery, which is called ecological succession. And finally, how all of that matters for human well being and how the ecosystem diversity of the planet helps provide services for our life and happiness. So there's a lot to cover. So let's get to it. The first objective is how ecosystems change over time. That's called succession. And it will happen because of a variety of things, right? So let's say dams, fires, herds destroying a savanna, a volcanic eruption, a new invasive species comes in and destroys the ecosystem. Disruptions will happen. After such disruptions, life will go through a process of recovery, which is called secondary succession. But life also does succession when it's starting in the first place, when there used to be no life there. And starting from bare rock, it's going to develop into an ecosystem over time. And of course, it has to be seeded, but between wind and water currents and things like that, and birds flying around, it's always possible for life to actually be taken from one place to another. Now, primary succession is a term that refers to the process of conquering a new ecosystem, colonizing it, usually like after a volcanic eruption or a new volcanic island formed. That's what we're talking about. Secondary succession is going to be more like after something caused the ecosystem to be destroyed or disrupted, what is the process that's going to take? And the way it works is that it starts with, especially if you have primary succession from bare rock, and only pioneer species like lichen can live on that. They don't need soil. And then they will, over many, many years, including with the help of the lichen, the rock will be broken down. And as the lichen dies and gathers, more and more nutrients will become part of the forming soil. And then you're going to get things like the weeds and annual plants, and then the grasses eventually and perennials. And finally, you're going to start getting some shrubs and mixed in with the grasses and what is called the intermediate stage. Finally, the trees will start to grow more and more, blocking the sunlight, making things like grass and shrubs not be able to make it very well, and only trees which are shade resistant will actually be left. But with all kinds of them, hopefully, for diversity's sake. Now, this is the process in a forest, and you can have something similar happen in a grassland, except you wouldn't get to the tree stage because there's not enough water and nutrients to do that. And that's the biggest difference. But grasslands are incredibly productive and diverse. They just don't necessarily have as much water to actually get to trees. But regardless of what it is, the general idea of a steady process that going from pioneer species, which are the first ones to colonize, to climax communities is how it happens. And this will happen after a fire too, or a disaster, except you don't start from nothing. You start when the soil is already there. So it's going to be a lot faster in order for you to recover. The second objective talked about some of these disturbances and key things that cause changes in ecosystems. So the first one, we talked about this idea of keystone species, and I spent quite some time talking about the wolf story in the Yellowstone Park. So you should probably watch that video if you're interested in finding out how a single species can actually cause an entire ecosystem to change. These are very important species for an ecosystem. Every species is important for the food web, and even changing a little bit can cause an entire food web to have cascade reactions. But there are some which are more important than others, like an apex predator like the wolf in Yellowstone Park. Removing it completely changed the ecosystem's life forms and even the flow of the water in the river. So that means that keystone species are very, very important. So I'm not going to get into detail on the story, but if you're interested, be sure you watch the other video when I talk about that. Another one that's important is this idea of an algae bloom, and that's when you get too many nutrients in the water and algae grows too fast, covers the water, and blocks the sunlight, and then ends up eventually killing all the life forms in it by suffocation, which might sound weird since algae produces oxygen. But as all of that muck forms, it blocks this other grass that's living underneath from actually doing photosynthesis. It kills the grass, and then that kills the habitat of whoever relied on it. And on top of that, as the algae grows too fast, it grows faster than it can be eaten, and then ends up falling down to the bottom and decaying through decomposition. And then that produces carbon dioxide, which actually suffocates everything else that's in the lake. And that's how the lakes die. And that will happen to all lakes at the end of their life as they get way, way, way too many nutrients, too many things living and dying on it. wasting on it and stuff like that. But it can also happen faster than that if there's runoff that goes into the lake. And there always is some, but if the humans are around and putting fertilizer or something like that, and that could cause a massive eutrophication to take place. This could happen in rivers too, to some smaller extent. Lakes are usually going to have it more because they're confined, and especially those that don't have a constant influx of water, either from ground sources or surface sources. And then they talk about other examples, like a tree falling in the forest and it's biological death, leading to the opening of the canopy and now more sunlight, leading to the possibility of things that could not grow without before, like grasses and shrubs, to take place. And then the decomposition of the tree itself is going to cause variety in decomposing life. And I talked about how deforestation causes diversity loss because you're going to kill habitats and kill species, and whatever's left is going to be less varied and less likely to survive because of it. So whether you're talking about an understory change because of one tree opening a tiny little meadow, which actually increases diversity, that's good news. But killing lots of trees all at once with deforestation, that's going to cause a problem. And in fact, it might even cost the soil because no longer there are roots to hold it in place. And eventually, because of a landslide, it can cause a massive mudslide and landslide to destroy even the soil of the ecosystem. This will happen because of human-caused deforestation or wildfires, whether they're caused by humans or not. But that's a serious thing for forests. Droughts will cause the complete collapse of the ecosystem because you're going to lose the producers, and everything else that depends on it will die because of it. I also talked a little bit about coral reefs and how when they get too hot, abiotic change, it causes the coral reef to expel the algae that lives symbiotic inside, and then that ends up bleaching the coral because the algae is what gives it its color, and the algae is important for it because it feeds it. So without the algae, it actually ends up dying anyways, and that's why over 50% of the coral reefs that used to be around our planet have gone away due to global warming. So biological and abiological changes, right? So biotic or abiotic changes, or changes in life or changes in physical characteristics of the environment will cause disruptances that will make the ecosystem change over time, which is why it's so important for ecosystems to be diverse. Because without diversity, something like introducing an invasive species could cause other species in the food web to die and then cause massive effects that cause the complete destruction of the ecosystem. An invasive species will typically outcompete its native species because it doesn't have natural predators. It might have characteristics that make it grow faster, and it can even carry diseases. All of it together, it causes the numbers of species that are native to drop. Now, if you have a lot of variety in an ecosystem, that might not be as bad but if you have a desert with low productivity, that's going to be very less stable because the lack of diversity causes each interaction in the food web to be crucial. You take one link out, the whole thing falls apart. But in a rainforest full of life, full of diversity, it's going to be less likely that a single change can destroy everything. So the more diversity there is, the more stable an ecosystem is going to be at surviving disruptions. So the relationship is direct. Diversity is directly related to the stability or resilience of the ecosystem. And in turn, if the ecosystem is more stable, it's going to have more productivity, which is also going to feed and help the biodiversity. All right, so that's why places like forests are so stable compared to a place like a desert that barely has any life in it. So the ability to survive disruptances is the primary reason why we must protect ecosystems. When we destroy the ecosystem, we're not only destroying that part, we're destroying what's left, because what's left is going to be less diverse and less likely to live because of it. It's a chain reaction. You destroy amount and quality of life, you end up with less life to actually support itself and save itself from future disruptances. And it creates a vicious cycle that ends up leading to extinction. So there are different types of diversity. There's genetic diversity, which is the diversity within a species. All the genes that there has, leading to different races and breeds and different shapes within organisms of the same species. That's good because a single disruptance is not going to make a lot of the population to go extinct. The population will be more tolerant to changes in its environment. One disease won't kill them all, as an example. There's also species diversities, which help ecosystems, which has been talking about that. That's the number that generally refers to the number of species that live in the ecosystem, not the number of organisms, because adding more of the same doesn't really add diversity, all right? So what we really want is different types of organisms. In fact, if you have hundreds of types, but 99% of them is one thing, that's not very diverse. So it's not even just the count of types, it's how the life is distributed in the amounts throughout it. So you want a lot of types of with a lot of life with each one. And that is going to make the ecosystem stronger, like we've been talking about, because the food web is more complex and a small change won't change everything. Then there's also the idea of ecological diversity, which gives the ecosystem its ability to survive as a world level. And ecological diversity is important because the more ecosystems the Earth has, the more the Earth can give, the more the Earth can provide, which takes us to the last objective, which is this idea that biodiversity provides for humans. The well-being of humans depends on biodiversity. There are things that the ecosystem does that provides sustenance. They're called provisioning, whether it's food or wood or clean water or energy or fuel sources. All of these are things that we as humans we need in order to survive. We are like part of the food web because we are alive. And so without it, we couldn't survive. We rely on it as a source of energy. We rely on energy as a source of resources. But life does more than just give us resources. It also regulates itself. The quality of the air and water, the ability of the ecosystem to get rid of toxins or process those pollution and clean itself, the speed at which water flows through an ecosystem and therefore how much erosion happens and where that erosion takes the sediments, which in turn affects the soil and its ability to actually support life. The ability of ecosystems to actually help life forms survive catastrophes like floods. If you have more life, there's going to be less flooding since there's more species to hold the soil in place. Clean air depends on life. Trapping carbon dioxide from the air will also affect the climate because it's a greenhouse gas, right? So all of these are examples of things that are only around because we have life. So without life, life itself couldn't actually manage it, right? And then you have this idea of supporting roles. And that's why it's in the middle of this diagram and this in the bottom of these, because those are the things that support the ecosystem as a whole, like productivity, having producers, making photosynthesis, giving the energy that is necessary to support things like biodiversity, like we just talked about, which in turn makes the ecosystems more stable and more productive. There's also things like the soil quality, which depends on nutrient cycling, the movement of water vapor and the movement of nitrogen and the movement of carbon and the movement of phosphorus and nitrogen and micronutrients throughout the ecosystem all depends on this, and it helps life support itself. You wouldn't have production if it wasn't for that. So the difference between those is, again, providing services are things that has to do with giving to life, giving resources that you can actually take. Regulating services has to do with managing the functioning of the ecosystem, and supporting services are the things that allow all of those things to exist in the first place. But it doesn't stop there. There's also a higher than life value, so to speak, which is the cultural value of life. A non-material benefit, such as learning from life and imitating life in technology, finding out resources through it, having fun with life, ecotourism, going there and having an existential experience where you feel connected to something that's bigger than yourself, and yet something that you can contribute uniquely to it and have an impact in. A sense of heritage where you can pass that on to the future. A sense of beauty and taking care of it all and enjoying how awesome it looks. Humans are evolved to appreciate these things because in appreciating them, we take care of them. And in taking care of them, we make sure the habitats are there for the future to support life and all of that. One more important one that I forgot to mention is water is also serves as a storage of carbon, because life forms in the water are the primary place where the carbon that gets emitted ends up in the skeletons of diatoms and all of the shellfish and stuff like that. That is going to end up storing a lot of carbon. And water itself dissolves carbon a lot more than the air does. So it's another awesome regulating feature of ecosystems. I also forgot to mention that ecosystems prevent the spread of disease and spread. That's another regulating effect. I did mention that it regulates the climate, right? So that's a pretty huge one. And so all of these things are the different kinds of awesomeness that is provided to us because of the diversity of life. If you have less ecosystems on the planet, and if ecosystems have less species living in it, and if species within them are less diverse, diversity at all levels of life would be compromised. That's what biodiversity means in general, the variety of life at all levels. Losing that variety will cost the stability, productivity of the ecosystem, which in turn will cost all of these things that life provides for us. So it's very important that we shift our mindset instead of destroying life to help preserve it. Keep it for the future so that we will have a future. Because after all, we are connected to the food web and to the planet. We are part of it. We are all in this spaceship Earth, and we have to take care of it. So that is biodiversity ecosystems. I hope you found this helpful. On the next video, actually, this is the last video of this series. So I'll see you on the next one. Don't do anything that would make Mother Earth proud.